Hi, so today I'm going to be examining the development of the English language, and with it the development of the English language pedagogy. I will attempt to explain what difficulties students encounter when learning the English language and how instructors can aid their students in overcoming these obstacles. When studying the languages that were first born into existence, there were certain assumptions that were made about the way that people were able to learn languages. It was thought that if one was born into a given language community, that they would be able to learn that language. In other words, the ability to learn familiar languages was considered an innate skill. But how do we learn a language that is not our own? How can we learn to express our needs and wants in the language that we have no knowledge of? For instance, if a person wanted to learn the English language, where would they start? Let's take a look at this by starting with the beginning of the English language. Just with any other skill that you wish to develop, you must first start with the basics. Consider the history of the English language and what first made people want to start learning it. Many of the first languages are connected through similar origins, and many of them share similar sounding words, such as the words you see here in both English and German. As linguists emerged and took interest in the structure of the English language, there were systems and laws that were put into place to assist in learning the language. Jacob Grimm created a system better known as Grimm's Law that would help explain differences between Germanic language and Indo-European languages. And since English is a direct descendant of the Germanic languages, it was necessary for English language learners to be able to see how those differences had originated and evolved. You can see on this table the similarities in the spelling of the English words and these Germanic words, as well as this example of how letters and sounds in the Germanic language were exchanged in order to create the modern words that we know today. However, there were some inconsistencies regarding Grimm's Law, as it did not account for the sound changes in Proto-Germanic languages. Karl Werner resolved the inconsistencies in Grimm's Law concerning the sound changes of consonants that were considered voiceless fricatives. This process is known as Werner's Law, and you can see here in this chart the changes that were made. Once we understand the foundations of the English language, we can begin to understand how to teach it to others. Between the 1750s and the 1880s, Europeans were still immersed in the teachings of classic languages, such as Greek and Latin. English had yet to become popularized in the educational system, but when English literature came on the scene in the forms of philosophy and theology, educators began to greatly value a reading-based knowledge of English. Since there was a greater focus on one's ability to read, there was also a greater focus on the grammar and the understanding of the English language. Grammar is something that can be quite difficult when it comes to English language, especially if one is learning it as a foreign language. If you notice this chart here, these are some of the mistakes, some of the common grammar mistakes that people still make today. Now, you may be asking yourself at this point how this information could make learning the English language any easier for a modern day student. But if you notice, the understanding of these original languages and the laws that were in place are quite similar to how students today prepare to understand English. As infants, we go from making sounds to babbling to forming words from the people we have around us. Eventually, we reach school age and we begin learning the English language by learning the letters of the alphabets and the sounds the letters make and what rules or laws govern how those letters and sounds go together to form words and sentences. In his book, The Principles of Language Study, Harold Palmer explained that the phonetic transcription can be extremely easy to learn, even for young children, as the half a dozen strange symbols usually required in addition to those of the ordinary alphabet can usually be learned at sight without any special practice. However, not everyone learns English while they are children, which by consensus is the easiest time to learn a language. Some people choose to study English as a second language, or at a later time in their education, or well into adulthood. But still, we begin the same way, by learning the letters, sounds, and eventually the structure and grammar rules that make up the English language. As we advanced in our teaching techniques, educators began to realize that their students were in need of a more conversational knowledge of the English language. While exploring the Reform period, which was the time between 1880 and 1920, in their article, The History of Teaching English as a Foreign Language, A.P.R. Howitt and Richard Smith explained that the dominant theme of this period was the need to promote the teaching of the spoken language as the main pedagogical priority, since, it was argued, speech is the primary foundation of all language activity. And if you're wondering about whether people were able to successfully speak or even read English before educators decided they wanted to add it to their curriculum, the answer is yes. Long before it was in the school systems, travelers and traders were already able to use the English language and were able to spread it among the common people that were not able to receive a formal education. Now, consider the fact that historically, educators tailored their lesson plans to fit societal needs of their students when it came to teaching them English. This is not much different than today's pedagogy of teaching English. But learning languages can be quite dull, right? So how do we overcome this hurdle? How do instructors engage their students enough to make them want to learn English? Raul Cavita and Caroline Torres help answer these questions in their article, Supporting Academic and Effective Learning Processes for English Language Learners. They make it clear that teachers of English language learners can engage their students and support language learning processes by designing lessons that take variability into account and building in options that engage students and give them a sense of agency and success. And when the students are successful, the teachers are successful. As we move forward in time, so too did the English language and its grammatical system. English language instructors were forced to evolve their teaching methods and conform to new linguistic rules. After the Reform period, classrooms around the world were expanding with culturally diverse students, as the English language was becoming more popularized in different education systems. Instructors had to contend with regional dialects and accents and this cultural sort of intrusion on the English language, and how that aspect would affect how their students learn the language. And in this new scientific era, there was a particular new basis for selection of vocabulary and later grammatical structures or patterns. By the end of the period, key features of all good teaching practices were considered to be the use of drills and exercises aimed explicitly at the formation of correct habits in the production of grammatical structures, which had themselves been scientifically selected. But consider a foreign student, and take a second to imagine the complexities of the English language. Now imagine trying to explain something like verb tenses or forms to that student. For instance, a present progressive verb, like I am walking, they are walking, or he is walking. Now, if you're a native English speaker, this is something that you probably learned in grade school. However, instructors that are teaching English as a foreign language must consider the fact that whatever language is the native language of their students may not even have a grammatical rule for present progressive verbs. This, along with many other cultural and regional aspects, is something that instructors must be able to account for in order to deliver a proper education of the English language. Trying to overcome such a large barrier, such as a student's culture, is something that instructors must learn how to do. In her article, Barriers to a Meaningful Instruction for English Learners, Lois Meyer says that perhaps the most important strategy a teacher can employ to lighten the culture load of lessons at school is to treat English learners, their homes and communities, and their primary languages and cultures with respect and not judgment. Instructors must also consider the fact that not everyone has received the same education. There are often times when an instructor believes that students will be coming into their classes with the same basic knowledge, which just simply is not true. So sometimes instructors must take into account that they will have to mold their lessons around their students and not the other way around. Therefore, instructors must learn to value their students beyond their time in the classroom and consider how those things affect a student's abilities to learn the English language. But respecting students from different cultural backgrounds and understanding their educational needs is just the beginning. Instructors can also adapt different learning strategies to help their students be successful in learning English. Starting around 1920 and beyond, educators began to understand that the ways that they had been teaching English and grammar were becoming stale. But it wasn't between around the 50s and somewhere around the 60s that new strategies were formed, such as the situational approach or situational learning teaching, which involved instructors providing pictures or context in which students could place words to give them further meaning. With the emergence of new technologies like the tape recorder and language labs, the ability to learn English and other languages began to spread farther and become a bit easier. However, with the emergence of the audiolingual method, which was pretty much the same as the situational method, just without the contextualization, the pedagogy of the English language seemed to regress rather than advance. Now, we have learned to adopt new learning strategies, such as the communicative approach, which utilizes versatile language learning techniques, new course design, and specifically studying English for academic purposes to advance our skills of teaching and learning the English language even further. So now that we have learned about the advancements of teaching the English language, as well as the different barriers that English language speakers or English language learners are still facing today, let's take one last look at how this information can help future English language learners. You know how they say that history repeats itself? Well, language and language learning techniques are no exception to this saying. English started as a byproduct of other languages coming together, just as scholars and linguists came together and formed the first of many rules and systematic laws of how to learn English. English became more simplified as various influences took hold within the language, just as instructors simplified their pedagogy to better aid their students. During the technology age, English spread further around the globe, which created more and more varieties of the language. Just as technology affected the spread of English, these different dialects and accents affected students' abilities to learn English. As instructors began using new methods of teaching and adapting, the English language also found new ways to adapt to this modern era and is still evolving today.